On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about why the beginner mead brewer should be using KVEIK. How do you say this thing?
You say it like
KVEIK. On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about why the beginner mead brewer should be brewing with KVEIK yeast.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
You may have noticed my very intentional pronunciation of KVEIK. That's because a lot of folks don't know how to pronounce the name of this yeast. And up until recently, apparently, me included. So I feel like I'm experiencing a little bit of a Mandela effect. If you're not familiar with the concept, it's where you remember reality differently than it actually is. And sometimes people share that memory of reality. It's that whole Berenstein versus Berenstain Bears sort of thing. And I swear that months ago, when I first started brewing with KVEIK yeast, that I looked up the pronunciation and the internet told me it's pronounced like quick, but with a V instead of a U. KVEIK. But apparently I've jumped realities. And it's no longer pronounced that way. I hopped on the internet before making this video just to double check my pronunciation, and I was presented with
KVEIK.
KVEIK. So I'm going to be pronouncing it KVEIK. So there are probably a lot of you out there wondering what the heck I'm talking about. I'm talking about a Norwegian farmhouse ale yeast. KVEIK yeast is very trendy right now, to the point that sometimes it's hard to get your hands on a sample of it. And this is not without reason. It's a really interesting yeast, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The premise of this video is that the beginner mead maker should be using KVEIK yeast. And this is an opinion of mine that has definitely changed recently. Up until recently, when my friends would get into brewing, I recommended EC1118. It's a champagne yeast, and it's got a lot of benefits. It's affordable and accessible. It's low foaming. It's a killer strain, so it will eat up other yeasts that are in your must, and it'll go all the way with you. With good nutrient, EC1118 has a ridiculously high alcohol tolerance. And also, it flocculates really well. It drops to the bottom of the carboy and holds a nice firm yeast cake that's really easy to rack off of. And so for beginner mead and winemakers, it's kind of a no-brainer to recommend because it does so much of the work for you while you're learning the best practices. It's super reliable, ferments clean, and does a bang-up job. It just sometimes doesn't create the best flavor profiles in more advanced brews. Enter KVEIK. KVEIK has a really interesting history. It's been used for centuries to brew, and those strains have just been carried over and cultivated up until present day. But in the last 10 to 20 years, it's become really trendy because it's such an interesting yeast. And so today I've got for you the top 5 reasons why I recommend KVEIK yeast for the beginner mead maker. And I want to pause for just a second because I want to acknowledge that later on in the video, we've got a promotion where we're going to be shipping one lucky person a sample of KVEIK yeast. Stay tuned for that. Here we go. Number 1, no temperature control. KVEIK is really interesting in that it reacts differently at different temperatures. And I have to preface this by saying that that nuance also carries over strain to strain. So Voss KVEIK yeast might ferment differently at different temperatures than hothead KVEIK yeast. And so it's important to kind of play with all the different strains within the KVEIK family. But the cool thing about this yeast is you don't really have to worry about temperature control to get an interesting and tasty product. I've seen posts on social media where people are wrapping their carboys up in black plastic and putting them outside in the summer and fermenting at those temperatures just to see what kind of interesting flavors come out of it. It's not temperamental at high temperatures. So one of the cool things you can do as a beginner mead maker is brew the same batch with the same ingredients and same yeast pitched into both, and put one outside in the summer and ferment one on the inside. And you can do an A/B test to taste the difference between the 2 different fermentation temperatures. It's really, really flexible at different temperatures, but again, for the beginner mead maker, if you don't have some sort of temperature control at home in your fermentation space, it eases some of the concerns in that regard. Number 2, aggressively reliable. I've been experimenting with KVEIK for probably about 6 months now. I've primarily used the Voss and Hothead KVEIK strains in my testing. And one thing that I notice every time I brew with it is that it is crazy reliable. This stuff, you pitch it, it takes off really well within about the first 12 hours. And at a lower gravity, like this root beer that's fermenting with KVEIK Hothead, it was done fermenting in about 7 days. And now given this is making use of proper nutrition and proper brewing practices, but it's crazy reliable, and as a beginner brewer, that's something that's really important because you've got so many other variables when you're learning how to make mead. Taking the guesswork out of a yeast pitch and whether or not that fermentation is going to successfully take off can be helpful to ease your mind while you're focusing on other things. Number 3, several of the strains are great flocculators. A lot of times beginner brewers will choose their yeast based on what's accessible and what they believe is going to be consistent when it comes to flavor. But something that's often overlooked is the flocculating quality of the yeast. Flocculation is when the yeast is done fermenting and it begins to clump together and drop to the bottom of the fermenter. And you can see with this root beer that the Hothead strain of KVEIK has great flocculating qualities. Voss also flocculates really well. And what this means is that your clarification process can start quicker and better than some other yeasts. So this is about 2 weeks old, and already so much of the yeast has dropped out to the bottom and created a really firm yeast cake. That means when I go to rack this off, I have less concern about this sloshing around and ending up in my racking cane. Flocculation is an incredibly important factor to consider when you're choosing a yeast. So many beginner mead makers follow internet advice that tells them that using bread yeast is okay for a fermentation. And we've gone over this topic in the past. One thing that bread yeast is consistently bad at is firm flocculation. It hasn't been cultivated or selected for that quality because that quality is not important in baking. So bread yeast in particular sucks at flocculating. The last thing you want to be dealing with when you're learning how to make mead is dealing with sucking lees up inside of your racking cane when you're trying to rack and then end up racking more than you need to and then worrying about oxidation issues. Get a yeast that flocculates well and take some of that concern out of your process. Number 4, it washes well. One of the great things about yeast is you can wash it and use it again. We've got a video on the method we use on this channel, but there's plenty of other videos out there teaching you how to wash yeast. The great thing about KVEIK is that it washes super well. And part of that is because it flocculates so well. So as you're separating your layers for yeast washing, you can get that layer of junk out quite a bit easier. Also, all the samples that I've washed have woken up really well with rehydration nutrient and gone right to work. The Hothead in this root beer is actually a 2nd generation that sat in my refrigerator for 3 months before I woke it back up to pitch it in here. And fermentation had aggressively kicked off in about 12 hours. It's a great yeast for washing, which is great because it's not exactly cheap. It can be $10 to $12 to get a sample to pitch into 5 gallons of mead. But if you wash your yeast, you can get 3 or 4 more samples out of there and keep perpetuating that batch to batch until you start to get to a point where you're developing all flavors. Wash your yeast. And number 5, it can also have a high alcohol tolerance. With a good recipe and proper nutrition, homebrewers are seeing KVEIK yeast strains get up to 13 to 16% alcohol fairly reliably. So if you're trying to make a really robust mead with a higher gravity and you're falling within that 13 to 16% potential alcohol range and you're using good nutrient practices, you can most likely carry KVEIK yeast up into that range. But what this really means if you're making a lower gravity mead in like the 8 to 12% range, you're going to get there. And for a beginner mead maker, that's a nice peace of mind. And like I said, EC1118, it'll get you all the way there, particularly if you've got good yeast nutrient in there. But EC1118 is also a relatively clean and crisp fermenter, meaning it's not gonna throw off a lot of nuance, and it also might gas off some of those more subtle flavors. But I would suggest trying a KVEIK yeast strain, seeing how you like the flavor profile that it builds, understanding that even into a medium to high alcohol tolerance, you're probably gonna have some comfort there that you can get it over the finish line. And that's kind of a bonus reason to use KVEIK yeast. It does do interesting things with flavor. Like I found that with the Hothead strain, in the high 70s to low 80s, you start to get some interesting bitter hoppy notes that can really complement a honey well. So give it a try. You can comfortably play around with different fermentation temperatures to kind of see what develops, and it helps you get a better understanding of the physics and chemistry involved in fermentation and how that changes the flavor profile of your brew. So like I said, we're gonna be giving one lucky winner a sample of KVEIK yeast. So to enter to win, all you gotta do is drop a comment on this video or on our Instagram post about this video, telling us what you would like to brew with KVEIK yeast. In about a week, we'll choose one lucky winner and ship you out a sample of KVEIK yeast. So let us know in the comments, what would you like to brew with KVEIK yeast? As always, you can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at Doing the Most OK, and our website is doingthemost.org. We got a lot of projects brewing right now, both in the brew room and in the kitchen, as well as converting this new house into an urban homestead. So stay tuned, keep doing the most, and we'll see you next time.